Hello and welcome to the Beginner Drawing Course, Week 0, entitled Where to Start. My name is Taylor Payton, and I will be taking you through this primer lesson, showing you how, as a beginner, you can start to get more comfortable with your tool, with training your arm and eye, having an idea of attention upon the process as you're going through it for drawing, and finally some general aesthetics that will give you a strong foundation of what to look for moving forward. So, in the interest of just getting through this lesson succinctly, I'm going to jump right in and just start talking about holding the tool. So, basically, whenever you're drawing, you want to make sure that you're holding your tool in a way that is comfortable and will allow you the most accuracy whilst drawing. And that means you may have to reformat the way you currently hold your tool just to give your joints more comfort and avoid some unnatural motions that may come up. So what I usually do is I like to take my index finger and my thumb and sort of use my middle finger as a stabilizer. And this allows me to have a lot of precision with these two digits here, and then this one stabilizes all of their motion. So it's like a 2/3 ratio of movement and one for stability. And there's just another picture of that. I know some people who will take their middle finger and use the tip of it instead, so that you have 3 points pinching down on your tool, and that's just personal preference really. All I would say is remember to just maximize the amount of comfort you have in your joints and make sure that it's allowing you to have accurate marks and movements. Even as a beginner, your movements are going to be a little uncertain anyway, but the accuracy will come if you're holding it properly. Lastly, this is just sort of an optional one of using more traditional media. This does not work on a tablet, or at least the tablets we have at this point in our technological development, but what it is you're holding it usually pencils or charcoal like this, and this allows you to get some more broader strokes that involve the whole arm rather than the wrist and elbow region. So that's just sort of a primer for how to hold your tools. And the next thing we're going to talk about now is training your arm and eye. So the eye is for seeing and information intake, obviously. So you just want to use it to shift yourself into different states of perception regarding what it is you're observing and using those different states of perception to take in information. The arm is what's going to express that information. That is the information output, and it will alter the information as it's expressed by the eye seeing it. So your eye and your arm are going to be working together in order to perceive and create. And that process sort of cycles. It's not just a back and forth binary thing, it's more of a cyclical program that runs. So you have an input, you sort of process information, and then you have an output, and then those feed into each other. So if the red were the input, that would feed to the blue process, and then we go to some yellow output, which leads us back into input again because we now have new information to work from. This is basically just another way of stating, looking at something and drawing it, or all the variants of that sort of perceptive process and creative process. Next, we're going to talk about an eye exercise real quick, just sort of to elaborate upon what I spoke about just a few moments ago. And the perception training is just to look at an object, and I will give you a second to find an object in your immediate vicinity. It could be your computer speaker, it could be your desk lamp, whatever is going to suit your observations, and then just start examining it thoroughly. So really look at all the shapes that it's made up of, look at how it's constructed, figure out its geometry, how does it look three-dimensional, where are the details, where are the more simple areas, and what are the colors. Just take it in as assiduously as you can. Take it in as thoroughly as you possibly can. And when you understand mostly its shape, which is what we're going to be concerning ourselves with in the beginner drawing course, then you can begin to take into account, some of those other things I talked about. But really, the basis is just all the shapes that it's made up of, its geometry, its volumetric primitives. Then you can create a mental model to test your understanding of what it is you're looking at. So if you saw your desk lamp, you just sort of have a picture of it inside your mind that is going to permit you to, draw it with reasonable accuracy, or a degree of expression permitted by taking in the information that you just did. So that was the input part, and the second part, the process, is getting that into your mind for understanding and for rotating and sort of that inner eye that we all have. And so you can rotate and pivot that model to sort of test it to see if it holds up or if you need to observe it more and understand it better. Because the basis of drawing is that seeing and then the understanding and then, creating it. So in order to actually create it, let's talk about some arm exercises. So really what you want to do is make movements as simply and as cleanly as possible. This isn't always the case, especially when you have a very rough idea to start with, and then you want to start refining it, but we'll talk about that for process. In general, you want to just make movements that are very readable to you and don't create too much information for you to process before moving on to your next action. So, for example, like I said, this stuff doesn't tend to look really great unless you know how you're going to be placing it. It's more about really distinct movements that have more of a certainty about them, where you can actually start to build things and not have to worry about creating all these separate and almost disparate ideas that you're going to have to parse and get back to later and figure out anyway. So you can just start off in the most kind of clean manner possible. And if you want to get a little rough later, then there's a way to practice that. But in general, beginners are very much, scratchy and not certain and making way too many marks when we really should just be much more distinct about it. Have a more deliberate plan of action for how you're going to get from place to place. And even if your lines are a little quivery, like mine are on the tablet, you can, practice making really distinct curves that have more of a confident edge to them. And that's how you improve your line work. Like the slower you go, the more jittery it tends to be because there are deviations along the line. And that will create that sort of wobbliness when a lot of people, if you want really attractive line work, it's usually just quicker, more certain movements that create that, because then there's no time for us to jitter. It's just that succinct spacing. Really get into the habit of paying attention to the marks that you make. So every time you create something, you can just, evaluate all the little bits of it and say, well, it was a little weak up here, and then some of these areas are all right. So I slowed down at the end because that's what this tells me. And you're basically learning to read the language of your marks. And every time you make another mark, it's in relationship to what you've already created. So again, there's input, process, you then have something to input again and process, and then repeat that three-part cycle. So every time you create another shape, it just adds layers of complexity, and you still want to have areas of simplicity, but once again we'll talk about that when we hit the general aesthetics one. So just remember to think about your lines, your curves, your marks, and your shapes. So LCMS, these are what most visual drawing related things are made out of. It's going to be the lines, which we'll talk about in week 1 of the beginner drawing course. This is also a curved line as opposed to a straight one, so you can also call it a curve. Then there are marks, and you can make marks in any capacity you want as long as they are succinct and cohesive and they relate to one another. More of the chaotic ones tend to have a less than desirable look unless you really want to cultivate a sketchy style and sort of blend all of that chaos together. But again, that's a slightly more advanced thing in sort of this process of teaching that I'm using and rolling out, because a lot of people again tend to go way too disorganized and chaotic, and they have a hard time parsing it and figuring out, areas of their drawing to improve. Last, there is moving with the wrist, elbow, shoulder, fingers, etc. So this is basically to carefully test as many joints as necessary for any given movement. So if I want a bigger circle, I'm going to have to move my arm as opposed to just my wrist. So let's talk about process real quick. A process basically is your steps when you're creating something. So you have a linear, logical, sort of stiff process. That's the step-by-step drawing books you see where it's like, first draw the owl, and then it's like, okay, well, there's some owl shapes or whatever, and then it's like, now add, the tail to the owl, and so you have your basic owl shape, which is the worst owl shape in the world. But you add the tail, and it's very stiff. It's a very stiff process, and it's good for understanding things in sort of a simple and succinct manner. but it also doesn't leave a lot of room for creativity, which can sometimes seem a little boring. Another thing is phases. So these are a little shifty, more modular and loose, and people who are really right-brained tend to resonate more with the phases of drawing, which you don't really have a really set linear logical 1 2 3 4 process. It could be, 3 2 4 1, and that would create a much different result. So a much looser, sort of almost not even not unfocused necessarily, but creating a lot of marks and then pulling some of the best stuff out of that is a little more shifty. Starting with painting as opposed to drawing, and maybe even with a soft brush, that's a more shifty, modular, loose kind of approach. So some people resonate better with linear logical stiff steps. Some people are a little more shifty, modular, and loose. But I would say use a hybrid of these. So find the parts where you can be a little more shifty and then still rein it in with more linear logical stuff, or places where in your linear logical process you have a little more modularity and can play around and finally create a result in your process that's going to be appealing to you and something you can count on, because phases tend to be harder to rein in, and that can drain a lot of energy and create a lot of mistakes and problems you have to iron out using these linear methods anyway. So we'll talk more about linear logical approaches in like later parts of the beginner drawing course and phases as well. This is just to get you thinking about the the general approach you're going to be using. Are you going to have more of a step-by-step mindset? Does that work better for you? Or are you a little more loose and you have a decent time reining that sort of stuff in? And finally, we'll talk about general aesthetics. These are things to keep in mind when you're working, things that just generally tend to work really well for visual imagery or just creation and creating things in general. One of them is unity with variety, so having an overarching theme or focal point and then having some variety around that, but everything still leading back into that unified aspect. Another one is design and deliberation. Every time you look at something that's really appealing or really well done, it has a design, and that design was brought around from lots of fundamental understanding, trial and error, perhaps, and a lot of pieces that were shifted around to create that unity that we talked about earlier. And that's done with deliberation. You deliberate on what it is you're going to do, the decisions you're going to make, how that's going to affect the whole, how it's going to bring everything back to that unification, and you deliberate on how much variety you add or something. So that's a lot to do with, just bringing everything back to the focal point, having a design, and having a point in general, because a lot of people are too nebulous, and if you don't rein yourself in, at some point you're going to just create a lot of messy, muddy work, and a lot of mistakes are just things that are too nebulous to read. It's like the equivalent of speaking to somebody in gibberish. It's a language that nobody really understands and doesn't really mean anything. So you want that design, that meaning, that deliberation. Lastly, we talk about fundamental solidity and technical potency. So that just means you understand the basics and you practice them over and over and over and over and over and over and over until you are sick of them, and then you practice them some more, because then you will have that basis down that will allow you to express in ways that are understandable and are cohesive and are second nature to you at that point because you've practiced them so much. This leads to technical potency, and technical potency is having your technique down. Your techniques are potent, which means they work. So if you had to take medicine and you were super sick, wouldn't you rather have potent medicine, medicine that actually has an effect on you, or would you have, sort of a so-so medicine, medicine that gets the point across and maybe it takes a couple more days to recover, or sometimes it peters out before it finishes, killing your virus or infection. You want potency in your work, and that comes from being proficient on the technical side. Basically means you are taking your fundamental understanding of shape, of color, of light, of values, things we'll talk about in later lessons of the beginner drawing course. Not so much color, that's the beginner painting course, but mostly taking those technical aspects, those solid fundamentals, and creating something with powerful unity in it in the end, and something that has all of those bases covered, because mastery is just mistakes getting smaller and smaller, right? So here's some awesome examples of really masterful artists Rembrandt and Jean-Auguste Dominique
And what we're
Ingres. Basically looking at here is masterful art that has stood the test of time. This art is built on fundamental artistic principle. The unity with variety, the shape design, the composition, the values, all of this stuff we're going to be digging into in the beginner drawing course as we move forward. Things that will permit you to create at higher levels. And speaking of creating at higher levels, let's get to your beginner drawing course week 0 assignment. So, in essence, the assignment here is just to practice the eye exercise, the perception training, as much as you possibly can throughout this week. So, looking at an object, examining it thoroughly, understanding its shapes, which means that you have a mental model in your head of that object, and you can hopefully rotate and pivot it a bit, and all those things stay in place, and it feels like you have that inner eye working to build your visual library, which will develop throughout the course. So that is the one exercise is the eye training, and the next exercise is the arm training. So that means moving your wrist, elbow, shoulder, and fingers while holding your tool properly, and just carefully testing all your joints while creating lines, curves, marks, and shapes, and trying to make them look as appealing as possible separately, so that when you start to give more complexity and form to those drawings and those shapes, that all the lines and curves and marks will fall into place better for you. If you want some specific drawing exercises, you can go to the Power Painters YouTube channel, and I have a small series called Fast and Easy Drawing Exercises for Beginners. And that basically is this video and these two videos here, and they will give you some great exercises to just throw some shapes around and get creating while training your arm and being mindful of the things that I talked about in this particular lesson. And if you have downloaded the beginner drawing course, if you are now a student of it, those videos have been included in your download as a nice little convenience. So thank you again for watching this first lesson of the beginner drawing course week 0, where to start. Hopefully this gives you some greater ideas and primers on how you can move forward with your art, training your eye, training your arm, and then adding that synchronicity and that synergy as we move forward after we temper these various, seemingly abstract and different parts of art, but they will unify into a more potent form as we crystallize your abilities through this course. So I'm Taylor Payton, and I will see you in week 1 of the beginner drawing course. Happy drawing.